We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
So our founding fathers were very aware of the risk of factionalism, a feature that is part of every democratic system. In Federalist Paper 10, James Madison defined factions as groups comprised of a number of citizens, whether accounting or amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Madison, as well as others, felt that there would always be factions, yet urged that we design a system that could control its effects. Today, it's clear that we have a very polarized political environment, but we are far from reaching a clear consensus on what to do about it. One option that's been conceived and received some coverage recently is the idea of ranked choice voting. So we're fortunate to be joined today by Nick Troiano. Did I get that right?
Yep.
All right. An expert on political system, staunch advocate for reforming our system of primary elections. Nick's the executive director of Unite America Institute and Unite America, a national organization that works to bridge the growing partisan divide by enacting political reforms. Previously worked for change.org, and which is a nonpartisan platform that empowers citizens to make informed decisions on election day. Ran for the U.S. House in 2014 from Pennsylvania's 10th district, and drew national attention as both the youngest candidate and most successful independent of the cycle, garnering over 22,000 votes. So I guess that answers one question for the viewers here. You affiliate independent?
I grew up Republican in a small town in Pennsylvania, and shortly after first couple elections I voted in, I realized this system is not designed to represent people like me or produce good results. So I've been an independent ever since, and concerned with where the country is headed, given the intense polarization and partisanship that we're seeing, which not only threatens policy making on issues that we care about, but now seemingly threatens whether we can keep the republic. And I think absent fundamental reforms to our election process, we're going to be in a heap of trouble.
Yeah, it's a question I get a lot. People are looking for a bit of an easy button though, and maybe ranked choice voting would garner some small improvements. But what I tell people all the time is, like, what it comes down to is, you're angry that nobody represents you. You being, not you, like editorial you being a normal American that kind of sees things on both sides of the spectrum and is like, I kind of agree with them. I mean, I can kind of see it with their way too. Mostly, I'm just concerned about getting my kids to school on time. But that's your normal American. And they don't feel represented because they're like, they seem crazy and they seem crazy. And I just want someone who's not crazy and wants to solve problems. And they want it to be simple. It's hard for it to be simple. And a question I always might ask back to them is, when's the last time you voted in a primary or got involved in these primaries? Because I'll tell you what, primary process doesn't see people like you. You don't go to the party meetings. You don't go to the Tea Party meetings. You don't go to the Republican Women's Club meetings. You just don't. And so it does leave out quite a bit of people. But again, the question is whose fault it is, and is there a way to structure things that doesn't include them a little bit more? And so we'll talk about ranked choice voting mostly, I think, in this conversation, and then any other ideas that come up. Let's dive into it. I mean, explain to people what ranked choice voting is.
If I can start sort of with the idea that a problem well defined is half solved, I'd like to first say something about the primary process to build on what you just said, which is what Unite America describes as the primary problem in our politics today, is that the vast majority of congressional seats, over 80%, are effectively decided in the primary election because those districts lean so heavily towards one party or another. Gerrymandering plays a part in that, but really the urban-rural divide is what's fueling most of it. And in those primaries, the rules restrict who participates. And in most places, it's just the majority party's electorate that gets to decide who their nominee is. And so when we looked back at the 2020 elections, we found that it was only 10% of voters nationally that effectively elected 83% of the Congress. And so that helps explain why there's such a big gap in Congress's approval rating versus how many members get reelected, right? The approval rating is below 20%, 90% get reelected. our elections are not designed right now to allow the normal people to hold their leaders accountable. And so from our perspective, that's why we have to change the system if we want to fix the people in it.
Yeah, and that does get to some other propositions that might be out there as far as, proportional representation and things like that. Because I think I understand what you mean by saying only 10% of eligible voters nationwide decided 83% of the House. That you're saying that's you're really only counting the primary voters in districts where it's in my district, it's impossible for a Democrat to win. It's just impossible. That wasn't the case in my last district, but now it is. So yeah, you could argue that the only votes that ever mattered were the people who decided to show up on primary election day. And then when you hash that out, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that those numbers are what you come up with, 10% deciding 83% of the House. It's kind of shocking.
It is shocking. And when you think about it, the firebrands in Congress who get the most attention, right, whether that's an AOC on the left or a Marjorie Taylor Greene on the right, and they're not equal by any means, but they're good examples to say.
But they're a lot more similar than people realize.
Only 5 to 8% of their electorates put them into office in the first place. And so most of the political conversation is dominated by people who aren't representative, not even of their own party, but not of their own district. And so that's why this systemic problem needs a systemic solution. And in our view, that is changing the primary process to serve the voters, not just serve the parties.
Right.
And the first example of what that looks like, and we could discuss how it works, is what Alaska is experimenting with for the first time this year, which is they replaced their party primaries with a single nonpartisan primary. So all the candidates are on one ballot, all the voters can participate. They choose their favorite regardless of party. And the top 4 finishers go to the general election. And in the general election, ranked choice voting is used to ensure whomever wins does so with majority support, because ranked choice is essentially an instant runoff. And that is a system that is intended to produce a leader who is incentivized to represent the whole electorate, not just the 10% that vote in the primary. So if we want more leaders in Congress who can put country over party, that's the type of electoral system that can better align those leaders' interests with those of their constituents.
Okay, well, let's talk about Alaska. Well, actually, can we do something first? Can we define ranked choice voting? And then since you brought up Alaska, let's talk about Alaska and what some people are upset about.
Sure.
So define ranked choice voting in the simplest way possible.
Yeah, the simplest way to understand it is through the voter experience, which is that instead of only selecting one candidate in a multi-candidate race, you have the option of ranking them according to preference. So this is my first preference, my second preference, third preference. And what that allows is that if no candidate receives a majority of support when they tabulate those first preference votes, then it goes to an instant runoff. So instead of asking voters to come back to the polls and say, okay, now we're down to 2 candidates, which is your favorite, we've already collected that information. So if your first candidate was eliminated in the next round of tabulation, then your second preference counts. And that process repeats until someone has a majority of support. So it's actually quite simple. And in exit polling, we have found that upwards of 80% of voters agree that it's simple. It's easy, 1, 2, 3, and it's a better and faster, cheaper way of having more representative elections.
I'm a big fan of it for primary elections. I have some hesitation on the general election, and so talking about Alaska, I mean, here's why Republicans are upset in Alaska because, well, just Republicans in general are upset because if it was just a generic Republican versus Democrat on the general election ballot, a Republican would win in Alaska. It does appear that the ranked choice voting, and now I'm struggling to remember exactly what happened in Alaska. I mean, you probably have a better idea than I do, but what basically happened was you got Sarah Palin and another candidate, another Republican, kind of a softer, more moderate Republican. Sarah Palin's like the firebrand, Trump supported Republican, and then you have a Democrat, and maybe the fourth person was also a Democrat, maybe.
Yep. Am
I correct? Okay. And so if you added up the percentages that Sarah Palin and the other Republican got, I feel bad, I'm not remembering the other Republican's name. It adds up to above 50%. And so the argument goes like, this isn't really representative of what the people want because a lot of people chose the other Republican 2, let's call her, you remember her name so I can stop saying
his name was Nick Begich.
Nick. Okay, so Nick was their first choice, but then they chose their second choice as the Democrat because they just hated Sarah Palin that much. So that I mean, that's an interesting dynamic. So again, I could argue this both ways. I could argue that it's not representative of the people,
Right.
and then I could argue that's actually exactly the point and exactly what the people wanted. So I was just kind of fascinating.
It is fascinating. And I think that there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions based on the outcomes and whether people nationally like what the outcome is or not.
If the outcome isn't what I want, then the process obviously sucks.
You're right. And that's the challenge of the moment in which we live. But the point is that the system better captures the nuanced preferences of voters. And in Alaska, you have 60% of voters who decline to affiliate with either political party. So although Palin and Begich's vote totals exceed 50%, it's true that a good third of Begich's supporters would rather have the Democrat Peltola over Sarah Palin, who has 60% sort of unfavorability ratings. So I think we can be confident in saying the outcome is actually more representative of Alaskans as a whole. And by the way, and this is where senators like Tom Cotton, who's taken some shots at the system, just don't get it, which is to say, if the ranked choice voting wasn't used, the Democrat had plurality support. She had, I think, over 40%. So the only way that a Republican could have won that election is actually through an instant runoff process. This election, that was a special election. It's going to repeat again in November, and it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. If the Republicans, under the system, it incentivizes candidates to run a positive issue-oriented campaign and build support across the broadest cross-section of the electorate. Palin chose not to do that, and I think that's why we saw the result that we did. And I think candidates will learn that lesson over time. When the rules change, you have to adapt, and this is going to be a better system that serves the voters.
How does ranked choice different from jungle primaries? So, like in California, everybody still runs in the same primary, similar to this issue with Alaska. And then the top two vote getters just go into a general. Seems actually, but there's no ranking, of course. But what do you make of that? Do you think that makes California better off or worse off? I'm not sure.
Well, you can consider California and Washington, even Louisiana and Nebraska, as top two systems, right? So everyone runs on one ballot. The top two candidates go to the general election. Alaska is what you can call a top four system. Same change in the primary. Everyone runs, but the top four finishers go to the general. And the reason why ranked choice voting is then used in the general election is because we wouldn't want someone representing us who doesn't have majority support from the electorate. So the instant runoff is used to determine who has majority support. So that's really the only difference, is that the Alaska system gives voters two more choices in the general election than they would otherwise have, which is good for a state with such political diversity as most states. You can have a more progressive and a more moderate Democrat. You can have a more conservative and more moderate Republican. And heck, you can even have an independent or a third-party candidate who otherwise wouldn't have much of a chance in the current system. So for voters, the value proposition is they have better options on their ballot. And for our politics as a whole, the value proposition is leaders who aren't just pandering right to the most extreme elements of their party's electorate.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm utterly convinced it makes more sense in a primary election. I take a look at my primary election. Now, my primary election, frankly, didn't have a lot of people disingenuously running to the right of each other. I'm still friends with most of the people I ran with. That is a very unique situation. Not one person said they were, that they were going to outflank anyone else on the right. They didn't use that rhetoric. It's fascinating. But that was 2018, and things have changed dramatically since that election. Dramatically. The election of 2020 was very different. This election is very different in terms of what candidates are willing to say on the stump to get elected and who they're willing to pander to. I mean, it's gotten extreme in ways that I just didn't see before. So in an election like mine, which is an open primary, like, you got a lot of local people running, and every local person has, at least a few thousand votes in their pocket, because they're just, if they're serious people, they have friends and family. They've done some campaigning. Maybe they don't have a lot of money, but they've done something. And then there's, a couple candidates that are kind of the obvious front runners. And then these days there's at least one or two that are just wing nuts, just willing to say whatever it takes. Like, well, here's the example I give people. It's like, well, I'm a conservative. I believe in making sure we have a secure border, like no tolerance on illegal immigration. And of course you can outflank me and say, well, I want to stop all immigration. And it's like, okay, I mean, we're not even having a real conversation anymore.
Right.
But that's what happens. I mean, that's a very normal thing to see in these campaign debates. And so that's usually how this fleshes out. And unfortunately what happens is, it becomes this choice. So you can either vote for your friend who decided to run for Congress. He's not going to win. But now you can vote for him. And then second choice, the guy who you think is probably going to win and who's decent enough, like you like him, okay. And make sure then that those vote goes to them instead of the wingnut, because it's perfectly plausible that the wingnut can win, and especially in these states. And this is the worst system where it's just a plurality of votes that wins. At least in Texas, you got to get 50%, and then it's a runoff. Yeah, so there's and honestly, I think that feature is very much demonstrated in the quality of candidates we end up with versus other states. It's very obvious to me that that's a serious problem.
Right. And that's one that the parties ought to care about as well. Meaning, if you're the Republican Party right now, you look at the US Senate, it's within reach, theoretically, of taking back a majority. But the folks that have emerged from the Republican primaries who have pandered to that extreme element are not competitive in the general election. We see that in Ohio, we see that in Pennsylvania, in Arizona. And so I think it's also in the party's interest to have a nominating system that produces candidates who can compete in these very competitive states and districts.
Yeah, there's a practical reason for it too, aside from just the ethical reason. But yeah, I mean, just the idea that somebody with 30% of just the primary vote is on a very clear path to winning a general election, like if it's a deep red or deep blue district or state, it's mind-blowing. And Americans shouldn't be happy about it. At the very least, if we didn't do ranked choice, you would think 50% would be the threshold.
Right. And I think Texas is a good example for the case for an instant runoff, which is, as you mentioned, if you don't get over 50% in your primary, there's a runoff election. Mm-hmm. But what happens is, between the primary date and the runoff is turnout drops precipitously, right? So
that's true.
The average turnout of a runoff in Texas is 4%. So you have 4% of voters within a party deciding these elections, right? Yeah. I don't know if that's
a good argument.
People who show up in November and think that, that's the election of consequence, when these races have effectively been decided, much earlier in the calendar by much fewer people. So there's a real dysfunction that exists within the election system today. And as I mentioned, it's not only producing a dysfunction in the policymaking process, it's a real threat to democracy. And I think it'd be interesting hearing your experience with this, which is the kinds of more extreme candidates that are running are willing to overturn free and fair elections. Now, a majority of Republican nominees for the U.S. House this cycle, right, aren't accepting the results of the 2020 election. And what does that mean when the next, crop of Congress comes in next year and we're faced with similar situations of close election results in the future? I mean, this is a, real threat to our ability to keep the republic.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have two ways of thinking about that particular issue. It's more of a threat of people are just willing to say anything to get attention. Because, look, I mean, the good news is none of these people will ever have any power to overturn elections, right? It was always a lie. It was always a lie. The whole thing was always a lie, and it was a lie meant to rile people up. And I've talked about this ad nauseum. It really made me angry because I'm like, the promises you're making that you're gonna challenge the Electoral College and overturn the election. There's not even a process for you to do that. It doesn't even exist. I mean, I was like, what the hell are we doing? And I would tell that to people kind of behind closed doors too, especially a lot of the rabble rousers, like the political personalities, not even the politicians. We definitely had the arguments behind closed doors in the Republican Party before that. But even just the others, they're like, yeah, we know that. But we just, people just need their last hurrah. Like they just need to feel like we fought one last time. Trust me, it'll be fine. And I was like, no, it won't. That's not what people believe. And that's not what you're telling them. And maybe you're smart enough to know that, but so we have a lot of people in the political world that are just willing to say things they know aren't true. they know aren't true. And it's a huge manipulation. I tell my own voters all the time, don't be easy to lie to, because there's plenty of people who want to take advantage of how easy it is to lie to you and how easy it is for you to believe them. If you want to believe it, right? Because people want to believe that, like, if they quote unquote fight hard enough, something will happen, but it won't, not in this case. So on the one hand, I'm like, no, I actually don't think it's as big as a threat to democracy as you do, simply because it can't be done. But on the other hand, I think the more generic threat is this extreme willingness to say the most extreme things just to grab people's attention, and then people's willingness to believe some of it. It could be election stuff. It could be, again, like I said earlier, like stopping all legal immigration as well as illegal immigration. I mean, it just could be anything. Like there doesn't seem to be any limit to how far some people are willing to go. And bringing it back to specifically how that manifests in primaries. Again, the problem is you got one wingnut who, and this is especially the case in places with plurality votes, you got one wingnut, you got 10 decent people, maybe a doctor, maybe a lawyer, maybe a school teacher, right? Just like people from different backgrounds. And you're like, they all seem nice. They all seem like nice Republicans or nice Democrats or whatever. And they'll all get like 5, 6, 7, maybe 10% of the vote. But then like wingnut over here gets 20% of the vote. And it doesn't mean that even the people voting in that primary would have chosen wingnut over anybody else, but they all split the vote. And it's a way more likely case that all the normal people split the vote, all the good, decent conservatives split the vote, as opposed to a bunch of wingnuts splitting the vote. I'm not even sure there's any examples of that. There might be these days.
Well, and I think that's why some Republican parties and even Democratic parties around the country are using this instant runoff process within their primaries to guarantee a winner that is more reflective of their electorate. Virginia did that with Governor Youngkin when he was nominated, as well as with a handful of congressional seats.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's as the own party chairman there says, it's a way of producing candidates that have a greater base of support and buy-in from the party, which strengthens those candidates when they head to the general election. And so I think we've seen some good examples of this. And not only do we need two healthy parties in our country, we need a healthy political system, right? If we're going to tackle any of the big issues that we face, it's just clear that they're not going to get solved through the status quo, and that the problem that we face with this challenge of partisanship is getting worse over time. Yeah. So while these systems may not be perfect, they're certainly better than what we've got today. And I think that's part of our country's tradition. We have evolved and improved our election system over time, right? You go back 150 years, there was no secret ballot. We didn't elect our senators because state legislatures did that. Plenty of people, non-landowning white men, couldn't vote even in these elections. So we just have a very strong history of looking at our democracy and seeing what are ways that we can improve it. And certainly in today's age, solving this primary problem is something that we can do for the good of the country.
In these states that have implemented ranked choice or the jungle primary, which it's not quite a ranked choice, but it's at least more similar to ranked choice than the closed primary system. I also wonder if you like one of those better than the other. It seems like you're more of a ranked choice guy, right?
Well, I think the idea of, I use Alaska as sort of the best model that currently is used and implemented. And what makes it so effective and powerful is that it combines what I would call a nonpartisan primary with a ranked choice voting general election. So it's a final four, top four system. You get the benefits of both of these reforms. I think in states that, if you had to pick one, I'd look at solving for the primary challenge first. And that's something that, for example, Washington, Nebraska, Louisiana, California have all done. By the way, some people, yep.
Well, go ahead. Finish
some people sort of dismiss this as, don't California my state, but listen, Louisiana has been using this for close to 3 decades. I mean, they did this in the 1970s. They actually got rid of party primaries. There's a general election. If no one wins a majority, there's a runoff. You can't say that Louisiana has gone all that progressive in the time since. So this isn't about engineering any particular outcome. This is about what election system can best represent the voters in that state.
And do you see higher participation rates in primary elections in some of these states than in other states? And I wonder why that is.
Yeah, we see substantially higher participation. In fact, in Alaska's first nonpartisan primary top 4 election that was just held over the summer, it was the 3rd highest turnout in their state's history. And I think the reason why is, I mean, people can make good arguments about all the tweaks that you can do to make voting more convenient. The best thing you can do to increase voter turnout is give people a real choice, competition, right? Give people a better field of candidates and a reason to actually go out and exercise the right to vote. So in Alaska, you had a ballot in which you had, in some cases, more than a dozen candidates running for a particular office, and you knew that your vote could really make a difference. And I think the combination of that choice and empowerment is what brings people to the polls. And again, turnout is a indication that the result is going to be more representative of more people, who are participating. So we see higher turnout, and then we also see it impact the type of candidate who runs, right? In the current system, the one that you described, the one that you have prevailed in over these years, a lot of people would look at that and say, I'm not viable enough. I'm too normal for an ability to win or say whatever I would need to win, those 5 to 10% of the electorate. So when you open up the system, not only do you bring more voters into it, I think you bring in more candidates, and you can improve the candidate quality as well.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with. Why did Alaska? This is a very recent development. Isn't this their first? Am I wrong about that? Is this their first election using this system? So why did they even do it?
Well, in 2020, you had a group of Alaskans come together to petition to put this idea on the ballot. So it was Alaskans who put it on the ballot and then voted to approve it. Mm-hmm. And it was a function of seeing in their own state legislature. Oftentimes we get overly focused on Congress, but we have 50 state legislatures as well that are succumbing to these growing forces of partisanship, not be able to solve the state's challenges, and folks getting primaried out of office who are working across the aisle. And so it wasn't serving their state anymore. And so that was one of the major impetuses for putting forward this new system.
Yeah, it's interesting because some more cynical people might think, this is just too complicated of a conversation to put on the ballot and have voters vote on it. But that's exactly what happened. And it seems people made their choice with some understanding of what they were actually voting on.
That's right. And we did an exit poll after the primary to ask, well, what do you think of the new system? And support for the nonpartisan top 4 primary increased by 11 points over what it passed with in 2020. So not only do I think voters understand it and like it, once they use it, I think they both understand it and like it even more.
Have you guys done any work looking at past elections, say looking at like AOC's elections or Ilhan Omar or Marjorie Taylor Greene, like some of these, like the squad, right? There's the right wing squad and the left wing squad. Yeah. Have you done any work at all looking at the data there and maybe showing people, like, based on the data we have, this is the outcome that would have happened. AOC would not be your nominee if this ranked choice voting had been in place.
We have looked at a bunch of elections, and I think when you do look at the so-called squad, as I mentioned before, Representative Ocasio-Cortez only won with about 5% of the eligible voters in her district in her primary. Both Representative Omar and Tlaib, for example, won with less than a majority in their primaries when they were first elected. So you do see these themes of unrepresentative elections producing more polarizing and less representative candidates, across the political spectrum. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with being a principled progressive or principled conservative or having views that might fall a little bit outside the bell curve of public opinion. But the point is that our elections should produce results that are representative of the electorate. And that's not what the system is doing right now. And it's having a real impact on how folks, govern, right? Because
I just think it would be interesting. I get that it's really hard to capture that kind of data and say, like, this would have happened for sure. And I'm just curious if that's even possible and what the outcome would be. But I bet you would see some different in some of these races. You might see the same outcome, but in some you might see different ones. And make us all a little happier. What do you think a system like this would ever lead to a viable third party? And then what do we even think of the possibility of a third party and what that would even look like? People, I know my answer to that, by the way. People ask me all the time. I'm curious what your answer is.
Well, if we can't have a third party, let's at least have two that can govern. So I start with the fact of like, how do we improve what we've got? And then how do we level the playing field to make new competition viable? As you mentioned before, I ran as an independent candidate for Congress in 2014. And I can tell you the playing field is not level, right? I had to gather 2 times the amount of signatures just to get my name on the ballot. You know, you campaign out there and people say, I like you more than the other candidates, but I'm afraid to vote for you because I think a vote for you would elect the person I like least. Again, because of
and they're not wrong. They're not wrong in that assessment.
They're not wrong because of the way that the system works today. To say nothing about the infrastructure and campaign finance systems that we have out there. But I think let's level the playing field, because even the threat of new competition can have an impact on how the 2 major parties govern, or even third candidates, as we saw in the 90s with Ross Perot, impact the kind of issue positions that the parties can take and how responsive they are to the electorate. What's clear is that we're not going to be able to have real viable independent candidates or third parties until we fix this system. And I think, you know, ranked choice voting is a way of getting there, because people can then vote how they really feel without having to vote strategically and worry about sort of spoiler candidates.
Well, let's go to some of the criticisms, some of the drawbacks. In 2018, former Representative Bruce Poliquin in Maine, he lost to Jared Golden after a ranked choice system went into effect in Maine. So Poliquin had the most first round votes, but after votes from independent candidates were reallocated, Golden crossed the 50% threshold. And, you know, it's not like Bruce was this wingnut, right? He was a well-respected member of Congress, really not extreme at all. You know, and again, the question is, was this a fair outcome for voters, or was it sort of a sly way for Democrats to sneak in? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the proposition first that having someone elected with a majority of votes, as I think on its face, a better thing than having someone elected with just a plurality. And that's why ranked choice voting, I think, serves the voters, because it can help ensure that outcome. In the 2018 race with Representative Poliquin, he didn't earn a majority of votes, right? And so then the instant runoff happened. And I think a lesson learned from that race is that instead of running that campaign under the new system with the representative campaigning for second place preferences for those who supported the Democrat or supported the independent, he ran against the system. He ran against the idea of what voters adopted twice in Maine, which was ranked choice voting. And so he didn't get a sufficient number of second preference votes, and therefore didn't win the election. And so I think the biggest takeaway there is when voters demand that these systems change and adopt these reforms, of which a majority of Mainers did, again, twice, it's incumbent upon candidates and leaders to adapt to that system, not to run against it, because it won't otherwise work out so well for them.
Yeah. Another criticism, and I could argue this one both ways as far as what the answer is, you know, the likelihood that voters even have enough time to evaluate 4 or 5 or 10 candidates that appear on the ballot and therefore rank accordingly. You know, that relies on voters being more informed than they currently are. Now, I suppose you might say, exactly, that's a good thing. So yeah, I mean, I could see that one either way, but I can also imagine plenty of voters just like randomly putting numbers in there, and then it doesn't really serve its purpose.
It does ask a little bit more of voters on an optional basis, which is if you still want to vote the old way, you can. If you want to have more voice in these elections, then sure, do your research, figure out who you might want to rank second or third. In a top 4 primary and general election like Alaska, that means you want to know who basically your first, second, and third preference is. And I don't think that's an unreasonable ask of voters. In fact, I think after these elections are run, like most things in our lives, we have preferences. You know, if this isn't available at the store, I'd rather go for this, or what's on the menu. Same thing when it comes to politics. And we know it from the data that people think the system is simple and they like voting under it.
All right, let's talk about a few other issues. I only got about 10 minutes
Sure.
max left, but I've seen the way a couple other states do things. California might do it this way. I don't quite remember. I've lived in California. I've lived in Massachusetts. I've lived in Texas. So we all do things slightly differently. One thing I liked, I remember in Massachusetts when I was living there and I had to vote, and they were voting on a proposition. They basically gave the people, the team in favor of the proposition, the team against it, so many words to declare why they think you should vote for or against this right there on the ballot. I loved that. That was fantastic. All right. I don't see why you can't do that with candidates either. Like if every candidate gets 50 words to describe yourself, you can say whatever you want, put it right there. And see, because I mean, just working polls all the time, I know we'll show up, and in Texas, like we elect judges. So, I mean, you got 70, 80 people on the damn ballot. It's impossible to really know who you're voting for. So we really rely on the party system, that the party is actually doing its job to vet candidates. That's a whole other discussion, because the truth of the matter is, and people who listen to this podcast hear me say it all the time, there is no establishment, there is no serious party. There is no council of wise men that like vet people. Like there's just there, and honestly, there should be. That's the whole point of a party. It's not just to like it's not just to rent out a building so that anybody who's anybody can put the red jersey on or the blue jersey on and be there. Like that to me is not the purpose of a party, but that's a different discussion that we can get to maybe in a minute. What do you think about that? Like just putting information out like at the poll in a very structured way, so that like, like this is objectively, who it comes from. Objectively who it comes from. It's not like somebody just giving you flyers, because that's what happens now, right? You're at least in Texas, like you walk to the polls and everybody's like giving you flyers as you go up, and you're like, I don't even know what's happening. There should be like a sanctioned way for you to see what's on the ballot.
Yeah, and in fact, when you mentioned what I did before this work, I was building an elections app to allow voters to crowdsource that, so they can recommend candidates or get recommendations from their trusted social network.
Interesting.
I think that we ought to, in this information age, make it easier for people to understand who exactly is on their ballot, especially in states that we ask so much of voters to weigh in on all these different positions. And one way of doing this, I'm a voter here in Colorado now, and we're a vote at home state. So you have the option of going to vote on election day, but every voter also gets a ballot sent to their home along with a ballot guide. And I find that incredibly helpful, because you can sit down and actually do your research before casting your ballot. And I think that informed participation is really important in our democracy, and ideas like what you suggest would be a good way of ensuring that.
Yeah, I like the voter guide. I do not like ballots just being sent to everybody's home. That just we don't have time to get into that, but I mean, it's just ripe for mistakes. I mean, you can call it voter fraud, you can call it whatever you want. It's ripe for mistakes, right? There's no way that the registration system is so good that they know exactly where everybody lives. They keep it up to date, and it's very high likelihood that people get ballots with somebody else that belong to somebody else that they can just send in. Drives conservatives crazy. This whole just like a universal mail-in ballot system. But I mean, but you can speak to that for a little bit. I mean, you live in Colorado. I mean, what safeguards are in place in Colorado to make sure that there's not massive amounts of fraud? And I don't think there's systemic fraud. I think it's extremely difficult to commit systemic fraud without getting caught. But I'm sure there's opportunistic fraud, right? Where somebody's like, why don't I just fill that one out too? Because I mean, they sent it to me. Why not? Well, my mom passed away a month ago and I got her ballot. Why not? What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, I think I think Colorado is sort of a model for the country, because there are certain things that the state does to make sure that its voter file stays current. So if I change addresses and one agency of the state knows that, so does the elections division in knowing if and where to send a ballot to. We also have signature verification. My signature is on file. I have to sign my ballot. Those things are.
But that doesn't work really well. I mean, so I have a stat that's kind of mind blowing. This is the Democrat primary election for presidential election 2020. There was something like 400,000 or 500,000 ballots that were thrown out by election officials because signature mismatch. So there's only one of two things that happened there. Either they were mistakenly thrown out and the people just fudged their signature, because like a lot of people who don't sign a lot of things have kind of different signatures. Like my signature is the same all the time because I do signatures all the time. It's not the case for everybody. So that's one option. which means a valid ballot was thrown out. So that's not good. And then the other option is there's literally that many people trying to commit fraud. Like there's no other options in between. And so I think to myself, I'm like, is this really a good system? Doesn't seem like a good system.
Well, two things. One, in Colorado, again, is a good model for the country. There's a cure period where if there is a mismatch, you're notified and you have the option of fixing that. And second, some states, including Georgia, I now believe, are replacing signature verification with an ID number. So it could be your driver's.
I like that a lot better.
And I think that, reduces the complexity of the challenges that you were just describing. But the system is secure. I mean, we also have randomized audits here in Colorado. We have ballot tracking. So this is an all of the above approach where you can make voting both more secure and more accessible. And how that relates to the discussion that we're having before is if we have a more accessible system where voters can be more informed, we can also have a system in which they can cast more informed ballots where they're also weighing in on their preferences. And I think these things can go hand in hand.
Well, what do you say to people? And I kind of fall in this category as a traditionalist. I'm like, I just don't, I'm like, you know how to resolve all of these problems? You just tell people to go show up and vote and show their ID and then they vote. I mean, that's a way to resolve all of these issues. There's some people who literally can't do that. And so we make accommodations for them in Texas if they're elderly or very clearly disabled. But there's also, I mean, it's not just for the security aspect of it. It feels like voting shouldn't be so easy that you just like open up your app real quick and just like do something, vote real quick while you're drinking with your friends. It does feel like there's this sense of duty, this sense of civic duty, that there has to be some minimal effort placed upon you to go vote. And I don't know, what's your response to that?
Well, I think there is in the current system in terms of people, needing to register to vote, needing to get and return their ballot. I mean, if you ask me, my own personal experience, returning a piece of mail is actually much harder than showing up somewhere. I'm a millennial. We're not used to doing that.
Fair enough. I kind of relate to that as well. How does this mail thing work?
But I do think the system is secure. And I think when we go back to the point before about informed participation, actually taking a bit of time to do your research is a net benefit, I think, for our political system. I compare it to my experience in Pennsylvania, where you show up to the polls to election day and it's basically like a test you didn't study for. And it's surprise, who do you want to retain your Supreme Court justice? I don't know, give me some time.
And how you get people that information is it's not an easy proposition, and how you do it objectively. What do you think about term limits? Another question I get all the time. Again, I know my answer. Curious what your perspective is.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we had competitive, accountable, representative elections, we wouldn't need term limits. But the reason why that they're so popular, I mean, 90% plus of Americans support these, is because we don't have the accountability we want at the ballot box right now. So short of any other reform, I'll take it, but I'd much prefer reforms that would give more power to the people. Term limits sort of take power away in a way. But we're seeing the real challenges of careerism, right, in our politics. We have the oldest Congress we've ever had. I mean, once people get in, if there's sort of inertia, we'll keep them in office for as long as they want because we don't have very competitive elections. So let's get at the root cause of it, rather than slapping some duct tape on it that might have some unintended consequences.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think it's such an easy button people want to press, but I'm like, who are you empowering with term limits? And you're empowering the staff on Capitol Hill, or you're empowering the executive branch, because you just have a bunch of inexperienced people who are just trying to learn. I mean, it's a big learning curve up here. And it just doesn't work the way you think it is. And I'm always asking people, okay, who do you think's gonna let's term limit out Nancy Pelosi right now? Who's gonna replace her? It's gonna be some like blue-haired transgender dolphin lady or something. Like, I mean, it's gonna be something crazy. It's San Francisco, so it's not gonna solve all your problems. Last topic. I'm kind of going through these fast. As you've mentioned, election finance reform. Curious what easy buttons you might press on that one.
I don't think there is an easy button on that one. I think in the near term, the best thing we can do is shine the light, right? Give some transparency to the process and let voters sort of make up their minds about who's trying to influence their elections and how. I've seen a lot of campaign finance reforms have a lot of unintended consequences to them. When you take contribution limits low, when you put restrictions on the current on the old process, you're pushing a lot of dark money through unaccountable PACs.
Right.
So I don't think there's
true.
a easy one, but let's shine a little bit more light on it. And I think there's a lot of other ideas in this reform space that sometimes get bucketed together. I want to be clear, at United America and personally, let's focus on the ones that are viable, can be impactful, and that don't have a partisan impact, meaning they don't advantage one side or the other. If we can really focus on that, we can make a lot of progress of improving our political system without voters feeling like one side is trying to, rig the rules in their own favor.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think people are always searching for these answers. In the end, there's a couple things that remain true. One is if everybody's playing with the same set of rules, keep in mind that you're only going to change things so much by changing the rules, because in the end, everybody's playing with those rules. And in the end, I think our problems are much deeper than just the system itself. I think they're cultural. I think there's a problem with people just not showing up to vote. I think there's a problem with people being too easy to lie to, right? Yep. There's like I can list them on the left and the right, like the sound bites that you have to say to show that you're a true conservative, right? It's like speaking a certain language. And I point this out to voters all the time because I want to show them this doesn't make sense. Like if you hear this, you're hearing it from a consultant's mouth and it's being spoken through that candidate. That is not an original thought. And you can't fall for that anymore. After you've heard it a number of times, you got to be suspicious. Why is it always the same way of saying, I mean, like we should be skeptical, and we should be original thinkers and critical thinkers. And, but most people are searching for answers in a third party option. And the more people distrust legacy media, the more they search for those answers in very deep, dark corners of the internet. And it's a scary thing. So it's harder to resolve those problems. That's a different one.
It is. I mean, we tend to draw a kind of three-part cycle of our cultural divisions, our polarized information ecosystem, and then electoral incentives. All of these things are fueling each other. It's sort of a doom spiral of partisanship and polarization right now. And we have to do something on the information side. We have to do something on the cultural side. It seems to me that the thing that we have most control of right now is how we design our election system. And if we get that right, it can have positive impacts on both culture and information. And so if we can do it, let's get it done. I mean, the beauty of our Constitution is that it gives us the tools to fix the things that are wrong in the country right now. And the Constitution gives every state, right, the ability to set the time, place, and manner of its elections. So all the ideas that we're talking about today can be done at the state level. In half the states, there's a ballot initiative process. In half the states, it can be done legislatively. But we, the people, can do it. We have a tradition of doing it in our country. And if we're not happy with the outcomes we're seeing, well, it's about time that we take charge and fix the system.
All right. Well, there you have it. Hey, there was a lot of compelling arguments there, Nick, and we hit a lot of topics. So I appreciate you being on. That was great.
I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate your service to our country and your ability to speak truth to your voters. So hopefully others are looking on.
Yeah. Well, thank you.